The clinking of champagne glasses filled the grand restaurant, a sound I usually found cheerful, but tonight sounded like a death knell. My entire family was there, beaming. My mother dabbed a tear from her eye, my father clapped my brother Mark on the back, and my ex-wife Sarah looked up at him with the kind of adoration she used to reserve for me. They were the perfect couple, celebrating their engagement at the most expensive place in town. The whole room was caught up in their glow, watching the handsome, successful man propose to his beautiful fiancée. They had no idea that in less than 5 minutes, I was going to burn their perfect little world to the ground with a single sentence. They were celebrating a union that was meant to be my final crushing humiliation. They didn't know that this entire party, the ring on Sarah's finger, the very company that gave my brother his impressive-sounding title, was all funded by me. Every sip of champagne they took was a toast to their own ignorance, paid for by the man they had discarded and labelled a failure. My revenge wasn't going to be loud or angry. It was going to be quiet, cold, and absolute. A simple pulling back of a curtain they didn't even know was there, revealing the pathetic reality they had built their lives on. My presence here wasn't an accident or a plea for reconciliation. It was the final move in a game they never knew they were playing. You're probably wondering why my ex-wife was now marrying my own brother, the golden child of the family. To understand how we got to this perfectly staged moment of destruction, you have to understand the family that made us, the roles we were assigned from birth, and the lie they all chose to believe. It all started not with hatred, but with a quiet, corrosive unfairness that dripped into the foundation of our home until the whole thing was rotten from the inside out. My story isn't just about a wife who left, it's about a family that threw one son away to prop up the other. And now the bill was coming due. In my family, there were 2 sons, but only 1 star. My brother, Mark, was born with a spotlight attached to him. He had the easy charm, the quick smile, and the kind of good looks that made people forgive him for anything. He could bring home a C on his report card, and my parents would praise his creative spirit that couldn't be confined by grades. If he half-heartedly took out the trash, he was lauded for his contribution to the household. He never had to truly work for anything because his personality was his currency, and my parents were his most eager customers. They saw in him a reflection of all their hopes, a popular, successful man in the making. Then there was me. I was the quiet one, the reliable one, the fixer. I was the one who got straight A's, not because I was a genius, but because I knew that anything less would be a disappointment. My achievements were met not with praise, but with a simple, silent expectation. Of course you did well, you're the smart one. It wasn't a compliment, it was a job description. I was the one who learned how to patch drywall at 15 because Mark punched a hole in the wall in a fit of temper. I was the one who worked a part-time job all through high school to save for a car, only to have my parents borrow my savings to pay for Mark's expensive football camp. They promised to pay me back, of course. They never did. This dynamic taught me a valuable lesson early on. In my family, reality didn't matter as much as presentation. Mark was the idea of a perfect son, and I was the utility that kept the idea running. He was the brand. I was the labor. He made the messes, and I cleaned them up. He got the glory, and I got more responsibility. I didn't complain. I just learned to be invisible, to work in the shadows, and to rely on no one but myself. I internalized the injustice and turned it into fuel. This was the foundation upon which everything else was built. My role was to work, Mark's was to shine. I was the engine in the dark, dusty basement, and he was the beautiful facade of the house. It was a dynamic Sarah, my future wife, would eventually come to embrace completely. When I met Sarah, it felt like I had finally escaped. She wasn't part of my family's toxic ecosystem. She saw me for me. She admired my discipline, my quiet focus, and my ambition to build something of my own. For the first few years, we were a team. We had our own apartment, our own life, our own rules. My family was kept at a comfortable distance, their influence muted. I thought I had successfully built a firewall, but I underestimated the persistence of their poison and its ability to seep through any crack. The primary point of infection was the mandatory Sunday dinner. Week after week, we would sit at my parents' table, and the slow, deliberate campaign to undermine me in front of my own wife would commence. It was never direct. It was always couched in feigned concern. Mark would announce a minor promotion, and my mother would declare him a prodigy. Then all eyes would turn to me. "And how is your little project coming along, dear?" she'd ask, her tone dripping with pity. "Are you sure it's wise to be putting all your eggs in that basket? You have a wife to think of now." At first, Sarah would defend me fiercely. "He's building a business from scratch," she'd say proudly. "It's more than a project, it's our future." But my family was relentless. They painted my entrepreneurial struggle not as a noble effort, but as reckless irresponsibility. They would talk glowingly about Mark's stable corporate job, his benefits, his company car. They were defining success in their narrow terms: predictable, safe, and most importantly, easy to brag about. My path was messy, uncertain, and required immense sacrifice, qualities they framed as character flaws. Slowly, heartbreakingly, I saw it start to work. After a few years, Sarah's defenses at those dinners grew quieter. The ride home would be silent. Then the questions started. "Are you sure you know what you're doing? It's been 3 years." Or, "Mark's company is flying him to Hawaii for a conference. That must be nice." She stopped seeing the man building an empire and started seeing the caricature my family had painted, the struggling, obsessive dreamer who was failing to provide the easy, comfortable life her brother-in-law seemed to manage so effortlessly. I wasn't just fighting to get my startup off the ground anymore. I was fighting a battle for my own identity in my own home, and I was losing. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. I remember the rain hitting the window of our small apartment. My startup was on the verge of a massive breakthrough. We had a potential investor, a giant in the tech industry, who was deeply interested. But to close the deal, I needed to fly out to the West Coast and present a flawless final prototype. It would take every last dollar we had in our savings, about $5,000, to finish the build and pay for the trip. It was the ultimate gamble, the final push after years of sacrifice. If it worked, we'd be millionaires overnight. If it failed, we'd be left with nothing. I explained it all to Sarah, my voice filled with an excitement I hadn't felt in years. I showed her the emails, the data, the clear path to victory. "This is it, honey," I said, grabbing her hands. "Everything we've worked for, 6 more weeks of eating pasta and being careful, and then it's over. We're on." I expected her to share my joy. Instead, a cold, flat look came over her face. It was a look I'd seen before, on my mother's face, whenever I tried to explain my vision. $5,000, she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "That's all we have left. You want to spend all of it on one more maybe?" I tried to explain it wasn't a maybe, it was a near certainty, but she cut me off. "I can't do this anymore," she said, pulling her hands away. "I want a real life, not a lottery ticket. I want what your brother has, security. A paycheck that comes every 2 weeks. I can't keep living on your fantasies." The argument was short and brutal. Every fear my family had whispered in her ear for years came pouring out of her mouth. She called me irresponsible, a selfish dreamer, a man who loved his project more than his wife. The final blow came when she said, "I'm leaving. I'm going to stay with your parents for a bit. They understand." Of course they did. They had orchestrated this. As she packed her bags, moving with a calm efficiency that told me she had made this decision long ago, I didn't beg or shout. I just stood there, watching the woman I loved formally align herself with my enemies. 10 minutes after her car disappeared down the street, my phone rang. It was my mother. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with triumphant pity. "I hope you've learned your lesson. You can't build a life on dreams. You drove that poor girl away." After I hung up on my mother, a profound silence filled the apartment. It was heavier than any sound. It was the sound of being completely and utterly alone. I walked through the rooms, seeing the ghost of Sarah everywhere. The indent on her side of the bed, her favourite mug left by the sink, the faint scent of her perfume in the closet. For a few hours, I let the grief wash over me. It was a cold, desolate feeling. They had all abandoned me. Not just Sarah, but the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. They hadn't just watched me drown. They had held my head under water. In that silence, a strange and terrible clarity emerged. They wanted me to fail. My failure was necessary for their own stories to make sense. My parents needed me to be the cautionary tale to justify their worship of Mark. Sarah needed me to be the irresponsible dreamer to justify her decision to leave for a safer, shinier option. My defeat would make them all feel righteous. And in that moment, I knew I had a choice. I could crumble, call the investor, tell him it was off, and go beg for a mid-level management job. I could become the person they all said I was. Or I could take their betrayal and forge it into a weapon. I picked up my phone. I didn't call anyone. I opened my contacts, found my mother's name, and blocked her number. I did the same for my father and then for Mark. It was a quiet, decisive act, an amputation. I was cutting away the diseased parts of my life. With them gone, the noise in my head stopped. All that was left was the mission. The next 6 weeks were a blur of work. I didn't just pour my time and energy into that prototype. I poured my rage, my pain, and my heartbreak into it. Every line of code was a rebuttal to their insults. Every solid joint was a testament to my resolve. I barely slept. I lived on coffee and instant ramen. I was running on nothing but spite and the last of my savings. When I finally boarded that plane to the West Coast, I was a different man. I was gaunt, with dark circles under my eyes, but I felt a cold, hard strength I had never known. They thought they had broken me, but they had only burned away my sentimentality. They had stripped me of my need for their approval. They took everything from me, not realizing that in doing so, they had given me the one thing I never had before. Absolute freedom. The freedom to succeed without anyone waiting to take the credit. I walked into that meeting in Silicon Valley looking like a ghost. I hadn't slept in 2 days, and my suit was the only one I owned, bought for my wedding years ago. But I didn't care. For the first time in my life, I had nothing to prove to anyone except myself. I laid the prototype on the polished boardroom table, took a deep breath, and began. I didn't just give a presentation. I laid bare the last 5 years of my life, the thousands of hours of obsessive work, the logic, the design, the soul I had poured into this machine. The investor, a man named Marcus Thorne, who was notorious for shredding entrepreneurs, listened without interruption. When I finished, he was silent for a long time, studying the prototype, then studying me. I expected him to pick it apart, to find a dozen flaws. Instead, he looked up and said, "I see a lot of people with ideas. They're a dime a dozen. What I don't see is this." He gestured vaguely at me. This level of raw, desperate conviction, it's either going to be a spectacular failure or a world-changing success. I like those odds. He didn't offer me the seed money I had asked for. He offered me 10 times that, for a smaller percentage of the company than I had proposed. In 1 hour, my life had changed forever. The next 5 years were a quiet storm. My company, which I named Resilience, didn't just succeed, it exploded. Our technology became the new industry standard. The money that flowed in was staggering, beyond anything I had ever imagined. I moved out of that sad little apartment. I hired a team of brilliant engineers. I bought a minimalist house tucked away in the hills, a fortress of solitude and peace. But I did it all in silence. I had no social media. I gave no splashy interviews to magazines. To the tech world, I was an enigmatic new player. To my family, I was a ghost. I never reached out. I never felt the urge to gloat. Their judgment had become irrelevant. I was healing. I was building a new identity, one forged in competence and self-respect, not defined by their expectations or disappointments. I was finally happy, and my happiness had nothing to do with them. I had almost forgotten the sting of their betrayal, burying it under layers of success and time. I thought that chapter of my life was closed forever. I never imagined that they would be the ones to reopen it, and in doing so, hand me the opportunity for a revenge more perfect than I could have ever conceived. It was a Tuesday, just like the day she had left. I was in a quarterly meeting with my acquisitions team, reviewing potential companies to absorb. We were looking at a mid-sized firm in the logistics sector. The name was unremarkable, the financials were weak, but its client list had some strategic value. As my team lead scrolled through the executive summary, a name on the leadership slide caught my eye. Mark, my brother, listed as the Senior Vice President of Business Development. A title so comically inflated I almost laughed out loud. I kept my face a perfect mask of calm indifference. "Drill down on that one," I said coolly. "Give me the full employee roster and a deep dive on their executive team's performance metrics." That night, in the privacy of my study, I did something I hadn't done in 5 years. I looked them up. It wasn't hard. Mark had a public profile, curated to project an image of effortless success. There were pictures of him and Sarah on lavish vacations, at expensive dinners, wearing designer clothes. And then I saw it. A post from just a week ago, a picture of Sarah's hand, a gaudy diamond on her finger held in his. The caption read, "She said yes, can't wait to spend forever with my soulmate Sarah. Big announcement coming at the engagement party." The post was flooded with fawning comments from my aunts, uncles, and cousins. My mother had commented, "Finally, we are so thrilled to officially welcome the daughter we always wanted into our family." The words were a deliberate, final twist of the knife from across the years. The timeline was sickeningly clear. She had left me and moved on to my brother almost seamlessly. The betrayal was deeper and more calculated than I had ever imagined. The next morning, I made a call to my firm's head of security, a discreet and ruthlessly efficient man. "I need a confidential and comprehensive background report," I said, "on my brother Mark and his fiancée Sarah. Finances, debts, assets, everything. I want to know the reality behind the pictures." The report came back 48 hours later, and it was pathetic. Mark was drowning in debt. He leased the fancy car, rented the house he couldn't afford, and his impressive salary was from a company weeks away from insolvency, the very company I was now considering buying for pennies on the dollar. Sarah had left me, a man on the verge of creating generational wealth, for a fraud. She hadn't traded up. She had traded a difficult reality for a comfortable lie. And as I read about their plans for a lavish engagement party, I saw the path forward. The cold peace I had cultivated for 5 years was gone, replaced by an icy purpose. They had built their entire world on a lie, and I was about to become its sole owner. My instructions to the acquisitions team were simple and brutal. "Buy it," I said, referring to Mark's company. "Their balance sheet is a disaster. They have no leverage. Offer them 10 cents on the dollar. I don't want to save this company. I just want to own its assets." The deal was done in a week. Through a series of shell corporations, I became the invisible owner of my brother's professional life. He had no idea. To him, it was just a corporate buyout, a changing of the guard. My first act as the new owner was not to fire Mark. That would have been mercy. Instead, I promoted him. I sent a memo to the new puppet CEO I'd installed, instructing him to elevate Mark to Executive Vice President of Strategic Growth. It was a meaningless title, but it came with a corner office, a significant and entirely illusory budget, and most importantly, a corporate American Express card with no preset spending limit. I knew my brother's character. He was a man of expensive tastes and weak morals. I was giving a starving man the keys to a banquet hall. I knew he wouldn't be able to resist. The reports from my security team started coming in daily. It was almost comical. He was using the corporate card for everything. Lavish dinners with Sarah, designer suits for himself, weekend getaways to five-star hotels. He was living the life he'd always pretended to have, and he was doing it on my dime. The final perfect piece of evidence came when he purchased Sarah's engagement ring. He disguised the $20,000 charge as client development and corporate gifts. He was so arrogant, so certain of his own cleverness, that he didn't even try to hide it well. He was funding his entire life with stolen money, and I had the receipts for every single transaction. Then the invitation arrived, a thick, opulent envelope with my name written in my mother's elegant script. Inside, the card invited me to celebrate the engagement of Mark and Sarah. A handwritten note was tucked inside. "We know we haven't spoken," she wrote, "but in the spirit of family, we would be so happy if you could come and share in their joy. Seeing how well Mark has done might give you a little hope." The condescension was so thick I could feel it on the paper. They weren't inviting me to celebrate. They were summoning the family failure to witness the triumph of the golden child. I placed the invitation on my desk next to the thick file containing the evidence of my brother's fraud. The trap was set. The bait had been eagerly consumed. All I had to do now was show up to the party and spring it. I walked into the restaurant, and the scene was exactly as I had pictured it. My family was seated at the best table, bathed in the warm light, the picture of prosperity. My mother saw me first, her face a mask of polite surprise, as if I were a distant cousin she'd forgotten to invite. My father gave me a stiff, awkward nod, and Mark grinned, a wide, triumphant smirk. It was the look of a man who believed he had won at everything. Sarah, seated beside him, looked at me with a flicker of something, pity perhaps, or discomfort, before turning her adoring gaze back to my brother. I took my seat quietly, enduring their questions about my little life, giving vague, non-committal answers. I was an actor in their play, waiting for my cue. The cue came after the main course. Mark stood, tapped his glass with a fork, and launched into a grand, saccharine speech about finding his soulmate and the incredible future they would build together. The room applauded warmly. My parents wept with joy. Sarah looked as if she'd won the lottery. Then I stood up. "I'd like to say a few words," I said. The table fell silent, an uncomfortable, tense quiet. They all looked at me, expecting a sad, rambling speech from the forgotten brother. "Mark, Sarah, congratulations," I began, my voice even and calm. "It's truly inspiring to see this. Mark, I have to say, I've been following your career with great interest lately. Your rapid rise to executive vice president has been remarkable. It takes a special kind of talent to achieve that, especially at a company that was recently acquired by my holding firm, Resilience." A ripple of confusion went through the table. Mark's smile faltered. My father frowned. "You're what?" he asked. I ignored him, turning my attention to Sarah. "And Sarah, that ring is breathtaking, truly. A symbol of a secure future." I paused, then looked directly at Mark. I was especially moved when I saw the charge for it come across my desk. It's a bold and creative accounting choice, filing a $20,000 engagement ring under client development. "You have my admiration, brother, and also my deepest gratitude for funding this entire party on the company card. I'll be sure to thank you in my victim impact statement." The colour drained from Mark's face. "What are you talking about? You're insane," he stammered. My mother stood up. "How dare you come here and tell these lies? You're just jealous." I didn't raise my voice. I simply gave a slight nod to a man standing near the entrance. My head of security, looking impeccable in a dark suit, walked calmly to our table. He placed a thick bound file in front of Mark. "Those are your signed expense reports from the last 6 months," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. "Along with evidence of wire fraud. The police will have a copy in the morning. It's called embezzlement, Mark." I looked at Sarah, whose face was a canvas of horror. The ring on her finger seemed to burn. "You left me for a man who could give you security. Instead, you got a common thief. Enjoy your party." I placed my napkin on the table and walked away, leaving them in the ruins of the world they had built. I didn't stay to watch the fallout. I simply went home. The details of what happened next came to me in sterile reports from my lawyers and security team. The restaurant staff, having not been paid, called the police on my brother for fraud. It was a messy, public affair. Mark was arrested the next day. Faced with an ironclad case of embezzlement, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. The golden child, the star of the family, was now a convicted felon. His shine had been permanently extinguished. Sarah, I heard, was a ghost. The engagement was, of course, instantly obliterated. Humiliated and saddled with the social disgrace of being engaged to a conman, she vanished. An old acquaintance mentioned she'd had to move back to her hometown to live with her parents. The life of luxury she'd betrayed me for revealed as a cheap mirage. She tried to call me once, a few weeks later, from a number I didn't recognize. I let it ring until it stopped, then blocked it. There was nothing left to say. My parents were perhaps the most pathetic victims of their own creation. Their reputation in their small community was shattered. Their perfect son was in prison, and their scapegoat son was the silent, invisible force behind it all. The final blow, however, was financial. My investigation had uncovered that they had secretly taken out a massive second mortgage on their home years ago to cover Mark's gambling debts. By sheer coincidence, the distressed debt portfolio my firm acquired included that very mortgage. I made one simple phone call and instructed the bank to call the loan due. They couldn't pay. They were forced to sell the house I grew up in, the very stage upon which they had played out their decades of favoritism and injustice. I took no pleasure in their destruction. The anger and hurt that had fueled me for years had cooled into a quiet, profound peace. My revenge wasn't an act of passion. It was an act of balancing. I had simply held up a mirror, and the reflection had destroyed them. One evening, months later, a thick letter arrived by courier. I recognized my mother's handwriting on the envelope. I knew it would be filled with pleas, blame, guilt, and justifications. I stood by the fireplace in my quiet, peaceful home, looked at the letter for a long moment, and then tossed it, unopened, into the flames. As I watched it turn to ash, I felt the last chain to my past break. I was finally completely free.